Hello, my name is YOODOO, and in today's video, I'm going to talk about 10 things that shocked me about Australian schools compared to American schools. So before I get into this video, I'm going to give a quick background of my situation and basically saying that in this video, I'm going to be talking about my experience and what I think, because certain parts of America and certain parts of Australia will have different high schools, different setups, and just different vibes. But I just want to quickly give my background. So I was actually born in Japan, and I went to Japanese school for a bit as well. But I'm not going to talk about my Japanese side, comparing Japanese schools, because that's a whole nother thing as well. So my background is that I was born in Japan, and I moved to America when I was very young. So I grew up in both Japan and America. But for a big chunk of my life, I attended American school. So I'm going to be comparing Australian schools to American schools in this video. And hopefully I can compare Japanese schools to American and Australian schools in the future. But in this video, I just want to focus on American and Australian schools. And this is a topic that I wanted to talk about in this video because there's actually a lot more differences than I thought when I have conversations with my wife and when we talk about our childhood and our past, especially when it comes to schools. It's so different. And yeah, I just thought it was really interesting that my childhood and the way that I grew up going to school is so different from the way that she grew up in schools in Australia. So I just want to talk about that. And another thing that I want to say is that depending on the location of your school or what state you are in America, so I grew up in California in an area called Orange County, and the area that I went to school was actually predominantly like middle class. My house was probably like 30 minutes away from Laguna Beach, even though we were in the middle class section of the area in Orange County. A lot of the people that went to my school, there were a lot of rich families as well. I would say that my high school was a mix of races. There were definitely a lot of white American kids at my school, but there were also a lot of, Mexican, Asian, and, African American kids at our school. So it was a mixed race, but I would say majority when I was going to school, it was predominantly white American kids. But that's something to be aware of because my situation and the school that I went to might be a very different experience from a kid in, let's say, San Francisco or even New York or anywhere else. I'm going to be comparing the high school that my wife went to in Australia, in Queensland. I think that for most of the part, this will be a generalization of each country, like in America and Australia. So that's something to keep in mind. Australian schools have uniforms, and I grew up not wearing any uniforms. I was wearing normal casual t-shirts and sweaters and everything. You can wear anything that you want at my school that I went to. I remember there was a time in my school where we weren't allowed to wear red or blue because of gang-related reasons, because there were the Bloods and Crips, which are like gangs in LA area. Some bad kids were starting to join gangs and stuff, even in high school and even middle school. But that was something that we weren't allowed to do in American school. We weren't allowed to wear hoods in class, but at my school we were able to wear hats in school, especially baseball caps inside the classroom. That's something that I think is different because my wife said that in Australian schools, obviously you wear uniforms, but you weren't allowed to wear hats inside. Yeah, in American school, I remember always having my hat on for 1 year because I played baseball, and I'd have like my baseball hat on during class and stuff, especially when it was right before baseball practice. I would have my hat on, and sometimes even wear my uniform the class before. So in American school, you can wear anything you want. Obviously, every school will have different rules. My school in California, we were allowed to wear tank tops as well at school, but I feel like girls weren't allowed to wear tank tops though, because you could see bras and stuff. But I remember guys were at my school would wear tank tops all the time because it was really hot and stuff. But that's something that I remember distinctly that we were allowed to wear. Girls were not allowed to wear skirts that were too high, mini skirts and stuff, obviously. Yeah, besides that, I feel like it was pretty relaxed. You could wear, hoodies, you could wear whatever band shirt you wanted to wear, anything that you wanted to wear, essentially, that was casual. So that's the first thing that I thought was very different when I talked to my wife about her experience and that she had to wear the same uniform. It kind of reminded me of my time in Japan. I did go to Japanese school for a little bit when I was a lot younger, and in Japan is very similar. You have to wear uniforms. There's definitely a lot more subtle similarities between Australia and Japan compared to America and Japan or America and Australia when it comes to uniforms and stuff like that. Number 2, no cops on campus. Australian schools, according to my wife, and I think even now, I don't think Australian schools have cops on campus, but this is something that at my school, even in Orange County, which was the area that I lived in, was pretty safe. I don't know if it is now still, but the area that I lived in was pretty safe, and we still had one cop that always had, full uniform and had a gun in his holster walking around campus, kind of like checking it out. There was a cop that was always walking around during lunchtime on campus. That's something that's very different, I think, in Australia. I can't imagine in Australia now being here now, a police officer walking around campus with a gun in his holster thing. But that's something that I grew up with. I thought it was, very normal in American high schools. And depending on the high school, I know that there's more security, maybe in the cities, because I remember my really good friend who grew up near San Francisco. He told me that when he was in school, he had like a metal detector thing that they had to walk through for school. We didn't have that in Orange County, but we did have a police officer that would walk around and kind of be like the school police security person, just in case of an emergency. And something that we also did as a school, we would have drills on campus. And I remember 2 drills that we had were earthquake drills, where we would simulated emergency things, where we would practice going under the table. But we also had lockdown school shooting drills as well. I remember doing that. We would go under the table. The teacher would lock the door and kind of simulate what a school shooting drill was like. And I remember doing that like maybe once or twice. But that's something that, we had to do in American high school, is to prepare for things like that, which I think is very different from Australian high schools. So number 3 is that the high school age is different between Australian and American schools. So in Australian schools, you go from year 7 to year 12, where in American high school, you would go from year 9 to year 12. Year 9 in America would be a freshman, and then you go sophomore, which is year 10, and then year 11 would be junior year, and then senior year. And that's the same with college or university. We call it college in America for university. College or university is also typically 4 years, and you go freshman, sophomore, junior, senior year. But in Australia, I was really shocked that it was year 7, which is really early, because in America, you have middle school. So you go primary school, middle school, which is 7th and 8th grade, year 7, year 8, and then you go to high school, which is 4 years, and you become a freshman, year 9. That's something that was very different from Australian schools, because in Australian schools, you start on year 7 all the way to year 12. So I had an older brother and a younger brother. Because my older brother was only 2 years older than I was, I would go to school with my brother. He would drive us to school. But my younger brother, I was never in school with him. But if we were in Australia, I would have been with my older brother and my younger brother, all in the same school at the same time. That's something that was really interesting. Personally, in my experience, I don't like the fact that it's year 7 to start high school, because I feel like year 7 and year 8 is really young to be included with a bunch of year 12 kids, because for really small year 7 kids, I think it's really intimidating and probably scary to be around these really old kids who have mustaches and stuff. But that's just my opinion. That's something that really shocked me, that high school starts really early for Australians. Number 4 is kids drive to school in America more commonly than Australia. So this is my situation of being in an Orange County. I don't know what it is like in cities, because obviously in cities, maybe people take buses, I think, more often. But in the school that I went to in Orange County, I would say over 80% of the kids by senior year, year 12, everyone would drive to school. And this is in Orange County, where a lot of the families were middle class and up. There's just so many kids that drive to school. When I was talking to my wife about this, I just realized how privileged of an area that I lived in, because it was like a normal thing that kids would drive to school, especially in a suburb area that I grew up in. It was just a normal thing. So many kids would live about 10-minute walking distance from the school and still drive to school. I think my house was probably 15 to 20-minute walk to the school, but most of the kids that lived in that distance would drive to school. Like they'll drive for 2 minutes and pay for a parking spot and just drive to school. And my situation was a bit different, because I played baseball in high school. I had a big baseball bag that I had to carry around all the time. So luckily, my brother also went to the same school. He would drive me, and I'd put my baseball bag into the car. That was the thing that I was really surprised about. My wife said there are some kids in Australia that drive to school, but I think it's less common than America, because I remember in America, like most kids in Orange County would drive to school, and they'd all have their car keys. And some kids would have some like BMWs and like really expensive cars. We always drove my dad's old Camry or something. And there was a time where I would drive my mom's minivan because that was all the car that was available at the time. But I just remember, driving to campus, driving to school, even though we were really close. That to me is a lot of privilege. Looking back on it now, I didn't realize how lucky we were. Yeah, just how spoiled we were at the time. But yeah, that was just something that I grew up with. The next thing I thought was really shocking is that in Australia, you can't leave for lunch. In America, at my high school, during junior year and senior year, which is year 11 and year 12, you are allowed to leave campus for lunch. So we had McDonald's and Taco Bell across the street from my high school, and you could just basically leave the campus. There was an In-N-Out that was about like a 10-minute drive, and our lunch was about 30 to 45 minutes maybe for lunch. I remember when I was a senior, I would drive out to go to In-N-Out and then get the food and then come back for my next class after lunch. That's something I found out from my wife, is that she wasn't allowed to leave campus during lunch, which is crazy to me because in America, you can leave for lunch at the school that I went to. Maybe this depends on the school, but I feel like in a lot of the California schools, you're allowed to leave for lunch, especially during junior, senior year. And that was something that was just normal for us as well, to be able to leave. A lot more freedom, I feel like, in America as far as being able to leave campus for lunch. The next thing is that education is different. I feel like America, I talk about this in my other videos, but I feel like America definitely has its own bubble when it comes to education. And obviously, there's so many aspects of similarities between things that you learn in Australian school and American school. My wife and I have talked about the books that we studied or read. A lot of Shakespeare. We have similar curriculums. George Orwell we read in school. America has a lot of emphasis on U.S. history and learning about the Constitution and American history specifically. And I didn't learn anything about Australian history or, obviously anywhere outside when it comes to European and history outside of America. I remember learning about, ancient civilization, things about China, but very surface level. And I didn't learn anything about Australia. I had no clue, nothing, no information about Australia. I didn't know about Aboriginal history at all, like zero. I didn't know anything about Aboriginal history. It's a huge thing in Australia, but that's something that you don't really learn in America. But I feel like on the opposite side, in Australia, I feel like Australian schools naturally learn more about American history, just about Native Americans and the people who lived on the land in America. But in the education system in America, you don't really learn about the deep history of certain countries like Australia with Aboriginal people and stuff. And maybe they do teach it now, but when I was growing up, I didn't learn anything about Australian history at all. So the next thing is that we have very different sports in high school. In America, we have a huge emphasis on American football as the main sport, I would say, in most high schools. We have baseball, we have basketball, and, a bunch of different sports. We also have cheerleading as a sport. Where in Australia, I feel like there's a lot of swimming sports. In general, I think the main difference is that when it comes to high school sports, there's a lot of school spirit and school camaraderie in American high school where you compete against different schools. We have games and stuff where the school will attend and, cheer the team on, the football team, basketball team, whatever. And it's very tied in with a lot of the school spirit and, cheerleading and everything. And I think Australia does have their own thing, but America has a culture where the sports is very involved with the school, and a lot of the students are involved with, cheering the team on and stuff like that. And it's very similar to what you see in movies, I think. The students and the kids are really involved with the sports. Obviously, not everyone, but as a school, I think that is something that I could say for sure is a big part of American school and American culture. Number 8 is high school dance. In America, having prom and homecoming is huge. It's one of the biggest events that you have in high school that a lot of people go to, and it's just a big part of American high school culture. I feel like Australia doesn't have something to that extent. I know that my wife said that she goes to like a year 12 formal, but in American school, prom is such a big moment in a person's life because it's just, overhyped in American movies. And it is a thing that is a big deal, like leading up to that event. There's a lot of events that, people are like, oh, when prom is this day, and people ask each other out, find creative ways to ask the person that they want to go to the dance with. It's definitely something that is a very big thing in American high school, where I feel like in Australia, Australia, there isn't something like that where you ask someone out to a dance or, during class, you have this big sign, you walk into a class, be like, will you go to prom with me kind of thing. I don't think there was anything like that. And surprisingly, I was actually homecoming king for my senior year. I don't know how I won, but they crown you and everything. Every dance, like prom and homecoming, they crown one king and one queen. In front of the whole school, they basically get this, at the dance, they get a crown and they announce who's the winner and they put it on the head. And yeah, you just get crowned king or queen. And I don't know how I won, but for my senior year of high school, I was the homecoming king. Number 9 is different secondary language. So in America, especially in California where I grew up, and I'm sure other parts of America as well, Spanish is usually the number one language that you learn as your second language. We call it an elective, a class that you would take outside of your normal math, history, science classes. You could choose language, and Spanish is the number one language, I would say. I know that Australian and American schools will definitely have similar languages, like probably German or like French, but Spanish is the number one language that most people take because there's a huge population of Spanish speakers. I would say 50% of my friends in high school were Mexican. I think being in California, being so close to Mexico, that's probably another reason why Spanish is always going to be probably the most useful language to learn. But I realized in Australia, Japanese is actually surprisingly one of the most common languages that you learn in high school, in Australian high school, which is awesome. If I was in Australia, in Japanese classes, I would have aced all my tests because I was born in Japan and, Japanese was my first language. That's something that I was very envious hearing from my wife, that Japanese was like the language class that you would take. And the last thing that I want to talk about is what is considered a popular kid. So this is a very interesting topic because I feel like this is always changing depending on the year and depending on, maybe the area that you live in. In American high school, a classic popular kid would have been a kid who was, a football star or people who are very outgoing in general. And in America, we have cliques, and you could tell by, obviously the clothes that they wear or whatever. If you think about the movie Mean Girls, it's kind of similar, definitely in that respect. A lot of my friends were skaters and surfers and stuff, and people who did music. And I was really into making music and playing shows and stuff in high school. A lot of my friends were people who played music, who skateboarded and stuff like that. So I feel like the alternative kids were basically kind of not part of like the whole social aspect of school. They were kind of like the outcast people. The classic football player was usually the popular kids, very similar to the portrayal of high school students in Hollywood, like the classic jock. But by the end of my high school career as a senior, it was very different because most kids would even leave campus by lunchtime. So this whole popular thing was completely gone, or it felt like it was gone, because everyone would be doing their own thing and people would be leaving by lunchtime anyway as a senior because you would take less classes. So people didn't really care about popularity and things like that. But I remember that was a thing that kind of goes away as you get older. And I guess as you get older in high school, you stop caring about, popularity and things like that. But I just remember being at school and, that was a thing that you kind of felt the presence of when you were in school. And that's something that I was actually really curious of, because the school that my wife went to, she said that the popular kids were usually like, the good looking kids, or the surfy kids were also like the popular kids. It's something very superficial. I think at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. Everyone's a human. Everyone should be doing their own thing. But I just remember in American high school, it was a thing that this popularity thing, you definitely felt the presence. I wasn't, entrenched in any of that. I just noticed and saw what was happening in American high school, and, just seeing what, this sports guy is very popular. I was just completely doing my own thing, so I didn't really pay attention to it. But it's just something interesting now looking back on it and, talking to my wife about our high school experience in American high school versus her Australian experience. Thanks for watching this video. These were the 10 things that I found were shocking and very different between American and Australian high school. So I'll definitely be making more videos like this. So if you guys can let me know what you guys would add to this list as well as an Australian that you find very different or very weird about American high schools, that would be awesome. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.